Welcome everyone to our first lecture for Psych 462, the experimental analysis of behavior. And hopefully you'll enjoy these lectures. These lectures will be posted usually Monday of the week. I try and get them in by 5, sometimes I'm a little bit later, depending upon what kind of chaos is going on at my home or the shelter. You know how it goes, typical craziness. And there'll be these lectures, and then there'll be, we'll meet on Zoom on Thursdays at our normal class time. And you'll find all of the various links on the syllabus. The syllabus is on my website, the typical instructor website, about.illinoisstate.edu / and there was my cat, VFDOUGA. So it's VFDUGA, no N, just DUGA. And you'll find it there, or of course on ReggieNet, and look under lesson 1. So look under lessons, and the videos and all the assignments, etc., will be posted there, and the Zoom link for our discussions. Same Zoom link every time. My office hours are also on there, and I think you'll find everything is hunky-dory, and we'll all get there. I'm going to put this cat collar on quickly. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I hope, I did it. And we're going to talk a little bit about learning and the introduction to learning. And let's see if I can go to a slideshow from the beginning. And we're going to do a little bit of history of learning. That'll help you. And then a little bit about behaviorism. And it's way too much information for you to know, but I think it'll help for Thursday's discussion. And then there are some ancient readings, literally. There's some Romani's reading from, I believe it was published in 1878. And there are a couple Pavlov lectures that were right around the early 1900s. They were published, not translated into English until the mid-20s, however, which is a whole other historical issue we can discuss on Thursday. And then there is a Skinner article from 1966, kind of arguing against what people think behaviorism actually is. And so we'll start with this. And I'm going to go through these first slides quickly because you've heard this ad nauseum. All right, you ready? If I can get this out of my way so I can actually see my computer. Yes, I have a crazy blind kitten in my way. Let's talk about what's learning, on the definition of learning. And I always start with students in the undergrad as well as graduate students about what exactly is learning. And people give me the dictionary definition of, well, you know, it is to gain knowledge, comprehension, mastery. Okay, those are all great definitions, but those aren't really scientific definitions. And because we are scientists, we're going to really want to rely on a more scientific definition. And so we talk about a relatively permanent change in behavior. So it doesn't have to be forever, allows for forgetting, but it's not due to maturation or typical physical growth, but it's due to reinforced practice or experience. And the question is always, well, why? Well, we don't want to include things like you just grew bigger so you could reach higher, because that's maturation. We want really practice and experience. And we want to include experience in that because certainly people do learn from their own self-experiences, and they're also more directed practice. And we do talk about behavior potentiality because obviously we have to measure observable behavior change. And the organism may know something and not express that. And that makes it sometimes difficult for a scientist to know what they actually know and what they don't know. And we get into the issue of learning versus performance. If you think about your test performance, that could be a problem. Did the GRE really measure what you know and how good you are going to be as a graduate student? Or did it measure how well you can do on certain kinds of questions under high anxiety situations on a computer? And my guess is more of a performance-based test. If we prepare for it, if we're fluent, if we practice with practice tests, we can perform better, and that gives us a better indication of learning. And this has become an issue throughout all we talk about. Did the organism know it, or did the organism perform it and show us what they knew? Okay, it's real tough. We can talk about that on Thursday. Remember that one and bring it up. So again, we have to remember to define behavior. We're going to talk a lot about instinct, and that's particularly this week. And instincts may emerge at different times. We've got critical periods. And again, I talk a lot about dogs, but dogs go through highly similar maturation as humans do. They show fears, much like humans do. They show stranger anxiety. They show separation anxiety. That's maturation. Dogs walk much later than wolves. We'll talk about that later. And walking in a way is both instinct and practice. That's an interesting one. Hopefully we have some developmental psychologists that are in our class this semester. I think Rebecca, and we'll figure out talking about some of that. There's always memory issues. Did you remember it or did you not remember it? And then motor memory versus more of our semantic memory. Of course, that's going to play a role. How much cognition is necessary? There's strong evidence that bacteria can learn. So I checked, they don't have a central nervous system or a brain. And kind of a funny definition of learning is if a dead man can't do it, it's learning. If a dead man can do it, it's not learning. All right. So again, we look at reflexes. They're very important for learning because most of our behavior is building on reflexes. Instincts, we're building on this. Practice, we talk about practice as more directed, where experience is kind of a free to be discovered accidentally. And performance is certainly an issue. We said that before. And so we have a modified definition of learning that says it's a relatively permanent change in behavior or behavioral potentiality. The result from experience, it cannot be attributed to temporary body states or maturation. We have different types of learning we'll be talking about across the semester. Classical conditioning, we can start with. Instrumental or operant conditioning, social learning, latent learning, cognition. But I think we'll argue that whatever kind of learning it is, humans in particular don't have a lot of instincts that we rely on for our everyday behavior. And certainly things like blinks, we flinch, we drop hot things, those are important. But really, when we're driving to work, we're relying on motor memory and behaviors. When we engage in discussions between each other, we're relying on our social learning and our social cognition. And we would argue that learning is really humans and probably dogs' strongest instinct, the ability to predict and modify our environment so that it benefits us and allows us to live is learning. And that is going to be what we do. We don't grow a winter coat. We don't get longer hair and grow a coat. Instead, we learn how to make a coat. We learn to change our bodies and our behavior so that we can survive. And those that learn, live. All right, so we can talk about the early history of learning. And certainly we can talk about Plato and Socrates as a teacher. Aristotle is going to be a student. And Plato talks about nativism, that knowledge is inherited and a natural component of the human mind. It's a matter of recollection, not of learning and observation so much, but learning and observation allows that nativism to be expressed. And that we experience every object in the physical world by having a corresponding or abstract idea in our mind. So in order to know what a tree is, we don't define a particular tree, but we develop the concept of tree nests. So when we see an object out in the world, we have a concept of treeness and apply that to that object, and that allows us to say whether it's a tree or not. And of course, Plato and Socrates talked about the cave. And I like to bring this analogy in. One, if you're in Psyche, you know that this is part of the initiation ritual and is a really important part of Psyche. But the idea is that there are people here and they are watching a screen of nothing but shadows. And there's some diffuse firelight and there's a fire that broadcasts light, and then people perform basically a puppet shadow and on the screen, and that's what people watch is a screen. These people have never been outside the cave in their entire life, and everything they know relies upon what's projected to them on the screen. And they said, well, what happens if you get up and you go out of the tunnel? You go down the path and out into the light. Well, at first you're blinded by the light because you've never seen daylight, but after your eyes adjust, what happens is you realize that there is a whole different world for which you have no corresponding abstract idea or form. And you have to recreate that and learn about the world and the richness of that world out there and how those objects are more direct than the shadows on the wall. And now you have a whole new world that you explore and you can have much more knowledge. And now you can engage in rationalism, reflecting on the content of one's mind versus the world. And you turn inward to ponder what's innately available. You have this incredible knowledge. And that's typically where the story ends. But if you read the entire cave, it's in Aristotle's The Student reading, and the cave goes on, the analogy goes on, because it says once you've gained the knowledge out of the cave, you're out in the sunshine, and now you know of the real world, that you have an ethical responsibility to go back into the cave and to teach others. And this makes it interesting because it suggests that the educated are not to stay in their tower, or in this case, they're outside above the cave, and say, boy, aren't we high and mighty, but we have a responsibility to go inside the cave and to continue teaching. And I think that's really important because now, of course, when we go back in, we've got a situation where these people aren't going to believe us. And the only way that they'll ever believe, because this guy here is showing them puppets, saying this is all there is to help them come out into the sunlight and show them this other world that's out there and teach them more about the world. I think that's a really interesting idea. The other thing that Plato really talks about, and Socrates really, is this idea of a soul and how we reminisce. So by soul, I think he's really talking about our mind. He's not talking about a soul in terms of Christianity, but it is a recollection of our experience. And Plato really believed, or Socrates really believed, that we had a soul in heaven, which is beyond heaven. And we had this almost collective unconscious is what he's really talking about. And so we have these memories that are in our mind, so to speak, or our brain, or whatever you want to talk about, that play a role in our behavior. And then we have to integrate those with what we know in the real world. I think it's a really fascinating approach to think about in early learning. If you look at modern cognitive theory, if you look at modern therapy theory, this is going to play a big role. Aristotle was Plato's student, took a different role. He was very much an empiricist. He said, no, the mind doesn't know everything. Knowledge is derived from sensory experiences, is not inherited. And rationalism is simply the mind involved in the attainment of knowledge. You have to learn knowledge, you have to organize that knowledge, and you have to figure out where things are in the world. And in nativism, the mind must actively ponder the information. So it's not a passive process, it's an active process. And we use our senses, all of our senses, to organize all this information. And he taught about the law of association, where we experience or recall one object and we develop a connection to that. So I see an apple and red, and now I have a connection to the concept of an apple, and it conjures up how it tastes, the sweetness, the whiteness of the apple, and then we have the color of the apple, and now we have this concept of apple, and we can bring objects that are similar. A green apple is an apple, but it's a little bit different in color and in taste. We can have objects that are opposite. An orange is not an apple. It tastes very different. It looks very different. They're both round. They both have roundness, but they're not the same. And so he talks about how this is how we're developing in the world. And he really plays on 5 elements that we have. We have fire. Okay, we know that. Earth. We have water. So fire, water, earth, air. Okay. Those we all know. And then ether. He talks about ether as this alternative place where the mind is. And we don't really have that today, but he's really talking about kind of an outside element that's outside the body, outside the physical sense, which I find interesting because he's such an empiricist. Well, then skip ahead, right over the Romans and everybody. So we forgot the Islam and their influence. We're going to skip the Egyptians for a while. We're going to go straight to Descartes. And Descartes was an interesting guy because he was a gentleman soldier. So he's kind of a bourgeois guy. He's rich, and his dad tells him to get a job as he gets out of the university. He's got a degree in religion, basically. And he doesn't know what to do, so he joins the military. But he's really interested in anatomy. And this is pre, cadaver labs in medical school. And he needed bodies to work on. So as a gentleman soldier, he would have kind of arrived late to the battle and get off his horse and cut up the dead soldiers who've been killed in battle and examine their bodies. And this is where he got his knowledge of anatomy and physiology. Now, Descartes is bringing back more of a Plato philosophy, a Socrates philosophy, where he's saying knowledge is innate. But by examining the body, he says, wait a minute, we have this physical body, and we seem to have something that's different in our brain or our mind. Now, at this point, the mind is still the mind. They're not sure where it is. For a long time, it's going to be in the heart, which I find interesting, because, of course, if you stop the heart, you stop everything. So they thought the mind resided in the heart for many years. But then we also have these laws of the body, and the laws of the body tell us how the physical part of it goes. So he is separating mind versus the physical body. And this is because he discovered something called the reflex arc, where he discovers that there are these spinal nerves, and those spinal nerves move, and mostly in reflexes, our arms and our legs in different ways. He didn't really talk about the eye blink as well, but he could actually find the neural circuits that occurred in the dorsal horns and now I've lost my other caudal horns of the spinal root, and how those nerves went out on into the body, because you get into arm nerves and things, and they're fairly big, and you could track them. And he really said, well, only animals have this, or only humans have a soul or a mind. All bodies have these animal spirits. What you're finding is the cerebrospinal fluid, and the mind influences the body animal spirits. And interestingly, the animal spirits have to be in balance, and that's where he got this idea of this reflex arc. So he's very important for us because he has physical reasons to divide the mind and the body. And he's one of the first anatomists who really has found a reflex arc, which explains some really early neurophysiology. The British empiricists are very important for us. The British empiricists include, but not limited to, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, James Mill, John Stuart Mill. And they viewed all sorts of knowledge as a sensory experience. So again, they really believe that people are born knowing nothing, and we gradually gain knowledge through our experiences. So this is the idea of tabula rasa, or blank slate of rocks, opposite of the nativism that Plato talked about, Kant, a German philosopher, nativism, we'll talk about in a second, or even Descartes. And the British empiricists embraced phenomenalism, rational empiricism, and pragmatism. They actually took some of them an extreme position of an empiricist position, where they believed that everything was learned. And we can disagree with that, going back to the fact that we do have reflexes, that we do seem to have instinct. But when they talked about knowledge as the mind, everything was learned. And the empiricists first outlined how concepts became associated in memory. So they're the first associationists, they really are. And they wanted to talk about how concepts are formed, how we develop a direct one-to-one correspondence between an experience and a memory. So there is a simple sensation that we see, and we develop a one-to-one correspondence with that sensation. And those sensations are built into complex ideas that form our memories. And a complex idea is two or more simple sensations repeatedly presented together. And the product is a complex idea. So again, an apple has the concepts of redness, it has the concepts of juiciness, it has the concept of roundness. So all of those together form the complex idea of an apple. And they can be evoked by any one of those associations. So the taste of an apple or the sight of an apple can elicit the concept of an apple and have you say apple, because it has complex sensations that make up the apple. Does that make sense? Thomas Brown came along with the secondary principles of association. And so he said, but they can be even more complex. And how they work together, how they connect, depend upon several hypotheses. The length of time that two sentences coexist determines the strength of the association. So the longer two things are together, the more likely they are to be associated, and the stronger they are to be associated. The liveliness or the vividness of the sensation affects the strength of the association, frequency of pairings, recency of pairings, freedom from other strong associations of its practice. And interestingly, he included constitutional differences, that the current emotional states, momentary states of the body, say an illness or a weakness or a tiredness, and individual prior habits all influence how we make associations. Does that sound familiar? And in fact, if you look at Ebbinghouse's rules for associations. They very much parallel what Thomas Brown said in the late 1600s. John Stuart Mill, again, talked about complex associations, James Mill's son, and his most important contribution, he first said a whole is different from the sum of its parts. Now, the Gestalts didn't say it first, but you notice we're all stealing everything over and over and over and rehashing it. George Berkeley was interesting. He said we can only experience secondary qualities. We don't actually experience a tree. We experience our vision, our sensation, our visual sensation of a tree. And so that nothing exists unless it's perceived. And to be is to be perceived. So if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. What he meant was it doesn't exist in my mind. To me, it doesn't exist. You could go all the way out through logical positivism and say, okay, it doesn't exist at all. I think you discussed some of this in Dr. Jordan's class, but that's really what they're getting at. David Hume, in the early, mid 1700s, said we know nothing for sure about our ideas. Nothing is sure. The mind is simply a stream of ideas and memories and imaginations and associations, feelings, and we experience the empirical world only indirectly through our own ideas. And habitual order of ideas gives rise to general concepts like causations. And it's interesting about David Hume, he's kind of insinuating that we view the world from our own viewpoint, and that our own viewpoints can influence how we see the world. And he started to talk about biases and stereotypes. Okay, so we go back across the continent, and at the same time, the British empiricists are saying everything is learned and how we make associations. We have French philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote a really interesting book I highly recommend called Emile, or On Education. He believed in stages to human development and that human knowledge was much more innate than the British empiricists, and that a child was born all-knowing but had to learn through experience to express that knowledge and to integrate that knowledge with the world. And that's what he was advocating for Emile, that Emile was a child who should not be in a desk in front of a textbook learning, but he should be out running in the field and experiencing and playing with water and gravity and so on to learn. Interestingly, the Italians believed very much in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's beliefs in child education. And if you compare, say, Maria Montessori's approach to education, the Montessori system, which is very experiential, to more of the British approach, which is rote memorization, you can see influences on later educational approaches. And America is quite the blend of the two. And we seem to argue back and forth as to whether we should be drilling children or we should be allowing them to explore. And the answer is, like anything in psychology, both. Our German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who I referred to a few minutes ago, talked about innate categories of thought, that we have categories including causality, unity, totality, reality, existence, necessity, reciprocity, and 5 more. And the idea is that our mental faculties superimpose over our sensory experiences to provide them a structure and meaning. This is interesting because it suggests that our brain may become pre-wired with categories that we use to interpret the world. So we have to get information in, but that our brain has this hard wiring to look for things like causality, which is going to be very important for many of our learning models. We assume that animals want to predict and control their environments. And Kant would not say that animals have the capability of doing this, only humans, but I think our research shows that animals indeed have many of these abilities as well. Thomas Reid had naive realism, and this is interesting because he says what we perceive, we believe is real. The mind has powers of its own that strongly influence how we perceive the world and what we believe and not believe. And this was really critical. I think it helps explain some current politics as well, that sometimes humans get so convinced of an idea that they can only interpret their experiences and their knowledge from that viewpoint. They can't get outside it. They have naive realism. Now, Franz Joseph Gall was one of our first physiologists in psychology, really was psychology because he studied the brain. And he said that the faculties, much like what Kant would talk about, were housed in specific brain locations. Okay, that's kind of true. We know that the brain has multiple areas for language, but certainly some areas are more significant than other for things like language or motor behavior or for self-control. But he was the first to suggest that this was the brain that did this, not the heart. And so he was moving the idea, and again, look at how late this was. Late 1700s, early 1800s, he's saying, hey, get out of the heart and look at the brain for thinking and for learning. This was interesting. But he did create phrenology. And phrenology is the idea that your skull develops around your brain, not the other way around, and that your bumps on your skull are there because it's pushing out of the brain, and so those brain areas are bigger than others. And phrenologists would do head readings. They would rub people's heads and measure their bumps and so on, and then give you kind of your horoscope for how you are. So because you had a big bump on your left side, you were better at this than others. And you can still, and I believe that Dr. Heidenreich does have a phrenology model in his office if you ask him. But what this did was lead to the emerging neuroscience research and the idea that our mind, our faculties become stronger with mental practice. And he very much saw the brain as a muscle in a sort of way. And in order to build knowledge in the brain, you had to practice. You had to use what you were doing. Interesting ideas. So we're going to get to psychology in just a moment, but I'm going to convince you that for learning in particular, there's three important scientists or philosophers that have a critical impact on learning theory today. Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. Now you're going, huh? Okay, this lady's crazy. No, why? Darwin suggests that we have common ways in which our bodies and our learning operate, that there's going to be some passing down of traits that are strong enough to help us live, help you live, and are more likely to be passed on. Karl Marx was in his writings was one of the first people, as well as Engels, to suggest that all people were equal. That just because you were royalty didn't make you smarter or better, it make you richer, but didn't make you better or smarter. And in fact, what we know from genetics is often the royalty have diseases and forms of developmental disabilities with them because of inbreeding. So that all people were people was really what Karl Marx is trying to say. And that's going to change how we view psychology. We don't necessarily have a caste system in psychology. We may have an academic caste system, but in a sense, a brain is a brain. You can have things happen to the brain, brains can develop in different ways, but just because you are of a higher status family doesn't make you better. And why Freud? Because Freud is going to suggest that our very earliest experiences are critical for forming how we frame our later experiences. And that early critical periods, and I certainly don't agree with his critical periods or his, in particular, with the reasons why, but he was a very good describer of childhood and childhood development and the idea that what happens in your early childhood can influence how you learn in your later childhood. Darwin real briefly. And again, he's famous for his biological and behavioral evolution in his 1859 book, Origin of Species, where he argued that species originated from other species and became distinct from their ancestors. So many animals have common parts. Many animals have 4 legs or 4 limbs. But if you look at how they use limbs, they use their limbs differently. Some animals run on all 4 limbs. We have arms and hands that we use very differently than our legs and feet. Other animals only have 2 legs, like birds. Right? Animals and actually plants as well come from specific genetic traits, and that we could breed. When we breed hybrid plants, we breed purebred dogs and cats. Hitler tried to breed humans. Thank God he stopped it because that would have been a disaster. We have a great similarity in our body parts, our embryology. If you look at a very early embryo of a chick, And a dog and a human, we all look about the same in those very earliest stages. But as we grow in utero or in our egg, we begin to differentiate, and a dog is no longer a human or a chicken. And fossil records really help bear this out. Now, when you get to psychological research for learning, Hermann Ebbinghaus is going to be very important. Again, he's the first empiricist. Use nonsense syllables, you know all this. But what's interesting is what he came up with, things like the list length. The greater the list length, the greater time to learn per item. The effects of repetition, of time on remembering, contiguity. The more closer things are in space to each other, the more associations we form between them. The idea of backwards associations. And he provided data for many of the associationist principles that were basically hypothesized by the British empiricists. Now let's get to Pavlov. Well, Pavlov was not a psychologist. He was the son of a Russian Orthodox priest, and he actually studied for the priesthood, and then went to his dad and said, "Dad, I'm not into it." And so he went back to school and got the equivalent of his doctorate in physiology, and went to the university, set up a lab, and began to study salivation. And he's interesting. If you really want an interesting read, and you're into history and into science history, read his biography. Fascinating, because he lived through the time of the Russian Tsar, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Bolshevik rule followed by the communist rule. And his lab never shut down. And basically, he was a very strong and opinionated man. When they said, "I'm sorry, you have to shut down your lab for whatever reason," he said, "Screw you," and he continued his lab. And so he made it through and was one of the few academics who continued his research all through all of these different revolutions. I find that fascinating, that at times being a jerk is a really good thing when it comes to research. And I think you find that today as well. Those who are persistent and somewhat jerky get the research funds. Right? What did he do? Well, he discovered and wrote about classical conditioning. And he found that his dogs reacted to both his presence and the time of day for feeding. And they salivated more right before they were fed, and they salivated more right before they started the experiment on salivation. Now, this was kind of cool. And he wanted a way to study the conditioned reflexes systematically so he could use this in his research. So he researched this by measuring the amount of salivation during baseline. He presented food to the dogs, he measured the slobber, then he added a predictive stimulus. And we all say a bell, but I think if you see in your readings, it wasn't always a bell. He presented the bell. In fact, I think he used originally something called a hooter. Well, today we think, what is he doing using hooters? No. He went on hooters like the restaurant, not that what that implies. He has a car horn, a ooga. He used that as a predictive stimulus. There you go. And he measured the dogs to see how they would respond to these associative conditions. And really, he was measuring association, a la the British associationist, a la Ebbinghaus, but in dogs. Remember the reflex arc? Well, he knows that a reflex can be elicited by a stimulus. So food on the dog's tongue elicits salivation. Nobody has to teach a dog how to do that. Dogs just slobber. Some breeds more than others. And then he wanted to make a stimulus before that predicted the food powder around the tongue, so that the dog would associate maybe the sound of the bell with food coming, so that they would learn to respond to the bell first. And so classical conditioning is simply learning to react to a predictive stimulus. And these words, predictive, is going to be the most incredibly important point in classical conditioning. So remember the word predictive for classical conditioning. The predictive stimulus predicts the eliciting stimulus. The eliciting stimulus elicits the reflex. And they learn to anticipate the reflexive behavior, and it occurs to the predictive stimulus. Why? If you know something's hot, you don't touch it, because that way you don't have to get burned and drop it. That is productive and potentially life-saving. So we touch a hot stove and we learn it's hot. What's hot? Well, on my stove, I have one of those glass stove things that I inherited when I moved into the house. There's a little red light that lights up on the stove that says hot. Well, if that red light is on, don't touch the stove. It's predictive. How do you know? Touch the stove when the light's on, you'll get burned, and you'll know. Don't touch it, and I avoid getting burned. And that's really the crux of classical conditioning, is learning to respond to a predicted stimulus to either get the good thing or to avoid the bad. So we have the bell is going to predict the food, which elicits the slobber. Now the slobber moves up in anticipation of the upcoming food, and it occurs to the bell. But what's interesting is the slobber that occurs to the food is physiologically different than the slobber that occurs to the bell. This slobber has actually fewer digestive enzymes. That's what I love about. And what he actually won the Nobel Prize for was in the salivation process, not actually classical conditioning. Now, we get into American behaviorism. Finally, we're getting there. We're about halfway through. So hang in there, stop it, go get a drink, come back. So we've got some behaviorists that we're used to talking about. Thorndike, he studied animal behavior. Animals learn to react to consequences. His son, second Edward Thorndike, E.D. Thorndike, was a educational psychologist and developed adult sight words